Loading. All right, and we're live on the Constitutional Roundtable. Your host Andrew, and then our consistent guest Douglas V. Gibbs. I don't know why I just like paused there. That was weird. And then also our new guest, but very warm welcomed, Poor Hamster. All right, so we're gonna continue where we left off, and then we'll get into the questions afterwards. So basically, where we left off, I believe I'll let Warhamster kind of fill us in where we left off, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Andrew. Hang on one second. Let me get the YouTube up live so I can see if anybody shows up and answer any questions. Hey, how we doing? So we were talking about, the question was posed to me about the Rothschilds, last week, and I kind of walked back through several centuries of how it's, this banking cartel, these multinational corporations have been dominating, the geopolitics for centuries, and that's basically what we're trying to, our forefathers, founding fathers, came here to get away from. And the Rothschilds are definitely a big part of that. And but the real big takeaway was that there's, it's like Game of Thrones. There's a bunch of different families vying for dominance, in the world. And but I wanted to get back to a little bit about, the original question was the Rothschilds. And I skipped over one of my favorite parts of that. See if I can find it real quick. And we had founded the first Bank of the United States in 1791. Doug, was that constitutional?
What the bank?
The first Bank of the United States. What do you think about that?
No, not at all. Yeah, I was kind of stunned you asked me that, but I forget we're asking the question for the audience, not for you. No, not at all. In fact, what's interesting about it is when Hamilton suggested it and pushed for it, Jefferson went livid on it, saying, "Wait a second, this is not only not constitutional, from your argument, that I mean, it's not constitutional because there's no express written authority, but also, and this is something I've picked up on later, is that Congress was given the legislative authorities that they were given. Article 1, Section 8 lists the original authorities." And in Article 1, Section 1, where it says they were given those authorities, it says that they were vested with them, which means they're irrevocable. They can't give them away. And so not only is there no authority for there to be a central bank, but to give the authority to coin money, which is in Article 1, Section 8, they can't do that according to the word vested in Article 1, Section 1. And while the debate was going on, and I don't know if you want me to get into this yet, but I will, Hamilton basically says, well, it's implied and in the Constitution. And Jefferson's like, that's not how it works. The powers need to be expressly enumerated. They can't just imply it. And if it implies these powers, as you're suggesting, Mr. Hamilton, then we have a Congress with unlimited authorities, unlimited power, not one of limited authorities as originally intended. And Hamilton went on to say, well, you've got to read between the lines. And Jefferson said, I did, and all I saw was blank space.
I love that quote.
It's like one of my favorites. I mean, Jefferson's like got the greatest comebacks, I swear. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, no, I segued that over to you because it's a really important point.
Yeah, and let me say this: it supports this idea of the enumeration doctrine, which means if the federal government's going to have the authority, it's got to be in the Constitution. And the recent Dobbs case, our Supreme Court essentially supported that very idea, so it's not forgotten completely.
And I bring it up, and I think it's so fundamental to people ask what happened to this country, and we had the enumeration doctrine, we had a constitution which was an ironclad contract of what the federal government could and could not do, and it started to get eroded from within almost on day one, and the very first attack came from the central bank, the first Bank of the United States, which was a Rothschild style bank, and the whole idea of the mercantilist system, which the Rothschilds were a big part of over in England, was that you would put the government in debt, and the people closest to the seats of power would benefit from that debt. The closer you are on the interest tree, the more you benefit from debt. and basically they would use that to wield, a disproportionate amount of power. Well, as you can imagine, the 1791, the bank charter, the bank was Congress somehow voted it in, implemented it, and gave it a 20-year charter. And in 1910, 11, it was getting ready to, come up for renewal. And it was very, very unpopular because in less than 20 years, it had done all kinds of economic damage in America.
Right.
Yes, some people will say, oh, they were building canals and stuff like that. And look, there's an economic argument to be made for state capitalism, but there's certainly not a constitutional one. And in this particular case, the economics do not appear to have worked out. It was so unpopular that they did not renew it. And in 1911, Nathan Meyer Rothschild wrote in the London Times, either the application for renewal of the charter is granted or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. 6 months later, we got the War of 1812. So that's the power of the Rothschilds. And I bring this up because, Doug, we've been working on another theory of what caused the War of 1812, and I'd love to have you do a quick overview of that, and we can probably go deeper another time.
Right. Well, go ahead with what you're going to say, and then I'll add color as necessary.
Well, I'm just going to hand it off to you with the missing 13th Amendment.
Well, okay. Well, yeah.
This all ties together of how they've corrupted our system from within.
Well, the timing's interesting. Okay, so let's go back. Let's do a little backstory. That's why I was kind of throwing it back to you. But let's do the backstory. So, what year was the Bank of the United States that the charter expired? And real quick, George Clinton, who was vice president of the under James Madison, probably the only good Clinton politician in the history of this country. That's beside the point. George Clinton, vice president of the under James Madison, who is president of the Senate. Okay, so this is important. And he's like, I'm totally against this Bank of the United States. We need to get rid of it. Let's make sure this charter does not get renewed. How does he do it? As president of the Senate, he's debating, he's lobbying the U.S. Senate not to approve this vote to renew the charter. Now remember, 1791 is what Moore-Hamster told you earlier when it came to the creation of this Bank of the United States when it first started, 20-year charter. So it's expiring in 1811. George Clinton wins. The Senate doesn't approve it. The charter expires. Bank of the United States is gone. Now, once again, you've got Europe angry because what has essentially happened is we have pulled ourselves out of European banking system. We are no longer connected to it. We are no longer manipulated by the powers, the centralized powers, the elites, the people who are in power because of their lineage, their birth. All of these people have no control now over our economy because we have pulled out of this. 1811. So now, at the same time, there's debates over other things, international influences. In fact, I was reading today in the Virginia Ratification Convention because I'm writing a chapter in a book right now about international influence by external foreign powers and what the founders thought about it. And in the Virginia Ratification Convention, this was a topic brought up by Edmund Randolph that was discussed quite a bit. Edmund Randolph kind of leaned in an anti-federalist direction, but he was willing to defend the Constitution. He even though he kind of leaned in an anti-federalist manner, he defended the Constitution during that convention. And he brought it up, says, hey, there are dangers. We don't want foreign influence. We don't want foreign countries involved and messing with our system. So we tried to write this thing in such a way, and this is before the Bank of the United States, mind you. We tried to write this thing in such a way that there is not going to be foreign influences, foreign manipulation of our system. That's why you need to approve this, because under the Articles of Confederation, the central system's so weak that what the foreign governments are doing is they're messing with the states and setting the states against each other. And this eliminates that by solidifying the union in such a way that if the international foreign powers out there want to mess with the states, they really can't, because now they've got to deal with the federal government. And so that was kind of the argument. So with that attitude going into this, now we've got George Clinton years later, who was instrumental in getting rid of the central bank, or the Bank of the United States. But what about the legal industry? What about the lawyers? Did you know there was actually a discussion during the Constitutional Convention to not allow lawyers to hold seats on the United States Supreme Court? They actually had that discussion. There were those saying, hey, lawyers should not be Supreme Court justices. Lawyers' job is to twist the law. We don't want judges who twist the law. We want them to apply the law as it's written. So that discussion actually came up. So we have this problem now in our legal industry. Lawyers, well, even today we don't necessarily trust them. And they're also, a large number of them are also politicians. So, and at the same time, there's an international effort to consolidate legal thought and the legal system. There's this international bar that exists. And so we're like, whoa, wait a second. We don't want to be a part of that. We don't want our lawyers a part of that, and we don't want any foreign influence. All men are created equal. No nobility, no foreign titles of privilege or titles of honor.
Honors.
Honors,
Honours. Yep.
And so we don't want these privileged classes or an international entity saying, hey, you got special privilege and you're a part of our international legal system, because we don't want foreign influence. So we're going to go beyond what we put in Article 1, Section 9, which says that that people who hold office cannot receive any gifts, hold any titles, anything, foreign titles, any gifts from foreign governments, any monies, any of that. We're going to extend it to something more. We are going to extend it to the average citizen. So there was and why is my pictures not? I'm looking for my pictures of some pages of a book while I'm doing this, but. So we are going to extend this disallowance of holding titles of honors, being knighted, receiving foreign monies, all of this. We're going to extend this not just from office holders, but we're going to extend it to the average citizen. We're going to propose this, and I found it, wow, quick. We're going to propose this, and we're going to put it out the states. Now, Brady and I have had tough discussions on the ratification, and I'm going to explain my end of it, and if you want to make any corrections later, you can. But, so they propose it, and it's ratified in 1811. Now, here's part of the problem with that ratification. In the War of 1812, 1814, the Library of Congress is torched along with the White House. The original papers showing ratification, for the most part, are gone. There's some states have their records, but the federal records are gone. So in 1819, Virginia puts out a booklet to reaffirm that ratification back in 1811. That says, by the way, back in 1811, we did ratify this thing. This is, just us saying in our booklet, just a reminder, we did ratify it. So it was a reminder or reaffirmation, whatever you want to call it. But that ratification vote, from what records I've seen, actually was originally done in 1811. Now, here's what's interesting. This missing 13th Amendment was ratified in 1811. The Bank of the United States was gotten rid of. The charter ended in 1811. I said 19, I think. I meant 1811. 1811. So what a coincidence they happened together. Let me read that original article, Amendment 13 for you. Because I have a friend of mine who has a copy of a book that was printed in 1825, and I'll read you the title page in a moment, which has it in it. If any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatever from any emperor, king, prince, or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them or either of them. If this thing was reactivated today, we wouldn't have any
good.
politicians. They would all lose their citizenship.
Hey,
Oh, you
Doug,
wouldn't have any. Go ahead, Andrew.
If they lose their citizenship, could they ever get it back, or are they? That's it.
Be a lot of
That's
groveling.
interesting. I've never heard that question before.
Yeah, there would have to be a lot of groveling, that's for sure.
Well,
Now,
the point where it gets interesting, and the reason we were talking about whether the Rothschilds.
by the way, real quick, let me add this real quick. So, real quick before you say that. So, Bank of the United States Charter expires 1811. We have the ratification of this 13th Amendment, which separates us from the international legal part of it. So, international banking, gone. International legal, gone. Foreign influence through those same channels and other channels, gone with this 13th Amendment. 6 months later, we're at war in the War of 1812, and we're told it's for reasons in our history books, for reasons other than what is obvious.
Yeah, and here's the fun part. You said it perfectly. I was going to ask the question, but you just came out with it. Well, the War of 1812 is United States versus Great Britain. 2.5, 3 years later, was it 4 years? Yeah, it's about 3.5 years later. War's over. Nobody's gained any territory. Nobody's lost any territory. What's happened is the United States debt has increased by 400%, and Congress realizes, heck, we got to print some money, and they end up chartering the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. That's basically what the war did. They forced us into debt, so we had to create another central banking system. War's a racket. Sorry, Andrew?
Who's the debt with, or is it just inflation?
We're borrowing money from other countries, issuing, and it's like states issuing bonds, et cetera.
Are you talking today or back then or both?
I'm talking.
Yeah, the 18. Yeah.
Like in the Revolutionary War, we were in debt with the French.
We issued.
Actually, I would say a lot of that money actually came from Holland. Matter of fact, we had borrowed so much from Holland that's when we started to have to start asking the French, was because the Holland's like, hey, we can't loan you anymore.
You got to pay
you're at your limit here.
In the War of 1812, we issued a lot of war bonds, which is basically summoning debt out of thin air with a promise to pay it back later. The United States didn't have the revenue source to pay it back, therefore they had to print money and devalue the currency. It hurts everybody, but that's kind of the way. That's what the central banking system does. They devalue the currency of everybody else, so the central government can deflate away their own debt. Fast forward. Well, we'll skip over that. That 13th Amendment is known as the missing 13th Amendment because sometime around the Civil War, it disappeared. Before that, the Second Bank of the United States disappeared in 1835-36 with Andrew Jackson, who ran on a platform of getting rid of it. But these are different stories for another day. I just wanted to circle this back to the Rothschilds and their influence on American history, because they absolutely had their fingers on the trigger, on the button of that. That's a very big change in the U.S. history. So now we're living in a world where the international legal system basically makes law in this country, and the international banking system 100% drives our economy. All eyes are on the Fed. So it's been a battle that's been going on since day one, trying to get away from these international interests. Any questions on that?
I have none in the chat. Me so far, no.
Okay. Well, then, with your permission, gentlemen, I will fast forward to where we left off last week. We led up to all the hanky-panky that went on leading into all the different special interests leading up into World War II. And that's a fun little story. Everything's connected. So I'm gonna bring the intelligence agencies back into the picture. We talked about Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that functioned as America's foreign policy, from the 1870s onward. World War II happens, and there was a ship. I'm gonna forget the name, Doug. If you remember, let me know. That sank in New York Harbor. They thought the Germans may have had something to do with it.
I know the situation. I can't remember the name of the ship either, but go ahead.
Yeah, I should know this one. I would have had it an hour ago. Anyways, the OSS, which is our military intelligence, says, okay, we got to find a way to secure the docks. And if you're going to secure the docks of New York, who are you going to go to? Well, probably the mafia. Well, it just so happens that John Dewey was the governor of New York. That's the guy from Dewey versus Truman, the famous election a few years later. Well, Dewey was previously the attorney general of New York, and he had just got done convicting Lucky Luciano. So Lucky Luciano's in a New York State penitentiary, and the U.S. government approaches Dewey and says, hey, we need to get Luciano to work with us. And, of course, Luciano is more than happy to do so. The mafia, the Sicilians, can't stand fascists because the first thing Mussolini did was lock up all the mafia guys in Sicily, the decade prior. And second of all, it's Luciano's way of getting out of jail, if you serve your country. And so he gets out of jail, and his whole job is he's supposed to move to Sicily. He'd end up helping the mafia help coordinate the American landing in Italy when we first went on to Europe. That entire operation was mafia led. But more importantly, this is called Operation Underworld. You can look this one up. It's very interesting. We now have the mafia working with U.S. intelligence agencies, and these U.S. intelligence agencies are basically led by people like the Dulles brothers and the rest of the Sullivan and Cromwell gang, including Prescott Bush and friends. Now, this is that whole. So now you got the mafia working with the American fascists who had already financed Hitler in the first place. Now that we're in the war, they got they can't finance the Nazis anymore. So now they're fighting for their country. When the mafia gets involved with an organization, they usually never leave. That's pretty obvious. Why would they? So that we've got two different criminal cartels working together, backed by an international banking cartel. The plot's starting to thicken. 1947, the OSS is disbanded and Truman starts the CIA. And I may get the brothers backwards here, but at the time, Allen Dulles is the Secretary of State, and his brother John Foster Dulles, the same two guys that negotiated the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. John Foster becomes the head of the CIA, and I may have the two brothers reversed. I always, for some reason, can't get them backwards. So when I think about the State Department, I think CIA. And from that day forward, the United States has been committing coups all over the world, toppling governments, destabilizing regions, mostly for corporate interests. We created the Banana Republic. All these, after England and us had divided up the Middle East with very crazy border rules post World War II. There's all kinds of friction between the countries. None of the dividing lines that we implemented on other countries made a lot of sense. This is all the work of the CIA. By some calculations I read recently, we've probably toppled something like 70 governments. We call these the color revolutions. The most recent ones, being Ukraine, the Maidan Revolution in 2014. This is what our intelligence agencies and our foreign policy has been doing. It's not a pretty picture. It is the ugly American, and I hate saying that about my own country. We've got a lot of brave people went over and fought in all these wars that were sold to us as being for their patriotic duty. Then you look at the reality behind it, and a lot of this was done for corporate interests. Mm-hmm. And these internationalists and these cartels, and it's a very sad testament. These are the same people that got us into Korea immediately, and they sold us about the red threat, from Russia and China, and maybe that was real. But we also had American corporations that were doing business with Soviet Russia, sending American technology to Russia so they could take arms and equipment to fight against Americans in Vietnam. These are war profiteers. All wars are banker wars. It goes. There's example after example of this happening through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. I was talking with someone the other day, and we're speculating on exactly why, Nixon was taken down by this relatively innocent Watergate scandal, which he wasn't even part of to start with. And that was a CIA hit job. Washington Post is where the CIA uses to launder their information. And possibly it's because Nixon wanted to get us out of Vietnam. That's a big moneymaker.
Hey,
and you can't go ahead, go for it.
So in that video you sent me the other day, it gave me a lot of questions, but it talked about this in there. Dr. Stephen Greer was speaking on that, and it actually all has to tie in with, I'm just going to say it, like it all has to tie in basically with, I'm trying to think of how to word this. Because it wasn't quite with the alien thing, because that was actually with Kennedy. Hold on a minute. Well, anyway, Watergate was to. Yes, actually, it was unfortunately tied in with UFOs, according to Dr. Stephen Greer, that Kennedy was killed because of that, because he told Marilyn Monroe about the aliens, so they killed her, and then they killed him because he was going to bring a lot of truth forward.
Yeah,
And then
I'm not buying any of that, but go ahead.
And then
Well-
according to Nixon, or according to him about Nixon, it was the same thing. He was actually going to release a lot of information about aliens and UFOs and the CIA and all that stuff. And instead of killing him, they did Watergate. There you
Yeah,
go.
Andrew and I were chatting on the phone last week, and we just got to the subject of the alien question, and I said, okay, well, I sure as heck have no idea whether aliens are real or not. It's interesting that Tucker Carlson and Dan Bongino are starting to talk about it, and the U.S. government officials are talking about it more and more. I mean, my
It's almost
spidey
like
sense
they-
goes
it's
off.
almost like it's almost like they want to normalize the conversation.
Well,
Yeah.
the fun is that he has documentation about this. He was actually
No, they don't have documentation of aliens. They have documentation of unidentified flying objects.
no.
There is a difference.
Let me clarify. They have documentation of the assassinations.
Okay.
Yeah, but I've always been going with the JFK assassination being the result of the fact that he stymied the Bay of Pigs, and there's an awful lot of connections between some of these same spooky figures at the CIA. Different people connected to family members, et cetera, and I can go into more detail on that later. But again, the topic here is the Rothschilds and these multinational corporation families. And I think the interesting thing that happened was in 1971, a bunch of really interesting coincidences happened. You got Henry Kissinger, who is a puppet of the Rockefellers, and Brzezinski, who is one of the architects of American foreign policy for the last 50 years, and a few other people. They formed the Trilateral Commission in 1971. World Economic Forum's founded in 1971. Kissinger makes a stealth mission to China to open up relations in 1971. The United Nations kicks Taiwan off the Chinese seat in 1971 and welcomes the CCP to the United Nations in 1971. The entire Green movement, the anti, all of these eco-Nazis, that was all launched in 1971 through 73. Nixon takes us off the gold standard at the same time. When you go back there and read some of the books these people have been writing, going back to H.G. Wells in 1902, this is the Malthusian depopulation theory. We've got too many people. We need one world government. They've always wanted to go back to feudalism, lords and serfs, and it's the American middle class and that spread around the world that gets in their way. So if you look at the last 50 years of history, they've been building towards this great reset that everyone's talking about today. That's when it started. It was 50 years ago, and it's the same actors, or the same families, the same foundations and corporations. And are the Rothschilds involved? Yeah, absolutely. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild sits on the board of directors of the World Economic Forum. They're absolutely involved. David Rockefeller's involved in all this stuff. They wrote, they call it the plandemic for a reason. Rockefeller wrote about the whole scenario in 2010. They game planned this whole thing out. This is it. It's on the Rockefeller website, the Rockefeller Institution.
Yeah.
All this stuff happened. So that's pretty much the fast forward version of post World War II. But it all ties together. It's this mercantilist view of these oligarchical families. They play on Game of Thrones. They are the puppet masters. They pull the strings. So I don't pay a whole lot of attention. Of course, we have to pay attention to Republican versus Democrat, red versus blue, right versus left. But it's all a distraction to keep us from looking up and to see who's pulling the strings.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a way out of this, and it's to go back to the original intent of the Constitution, where you decentralize the government. It's because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They want centralization in their banking, in their government, in their corporations. And remember, they're cartels, and cartels exist to eliminate competition. Well, the cure to that's very simple. Decentralize the government and basically induce competition. And that's really the big picture and the moral of my story.
So I have a quick disclaimer, because I know I got a little weird in the beginning. I don't believe aliens are real. I believe if aliens existed, they're demons. So I just want to make that.
I believe they're demonic emanations myself, but go ahead.
I have no idea what I believe on that one. I'm keeping an open mind.
But anyway, I was just stating what he said. But Doug, I actually speaking since we brought up the CIA and all these other things and presidents, I actually did have a question for you. It's not quite tied in, but it is kind of tied in. Is plausible deniability for a president constitutional?
Well, not really. It's not among the powers listed, but over tradition, over time, they have kind of instituted and integrated that into what president is. Plausible deniability really isn't a political idea anyway. It's really just if they don't know, they can't they can deny it very easily because they don't know. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's more of a this is how we get out of a pickle type of thing than it is anything political
Well, let,
or legal.
let me ask you a similar question what Andrew just asked, and it has to do
Okay.
with the current case going on with Trump and Mar-a-Lago. Does he have the right to declassify anything?
Absolutely.
Well, constitutionally, yes. But do you think if Trump asked to see all the CIA files, they would have let him, or
Probably
JFK,
not.
or any?
Probably not.
Uh-huh. So we basically have a government that's running above the law. If the president is the absolute authority, and they can keep him from seeing something, we de facto have a shadow government.
Yeah, and here's something else is kind of it's tying in from what you and I talked about the other day, Warhamster, and it kind of ties in today, especially with corporate interests. I think one of the biggest problems that we have is the government basically backdooring through corporations, but also we don't hold corporations, I think, in a more accountable way as well, especially whenever they're working with the government. An example would be, for instance, the Atomic Energy Commission. Almost everything is done through private companies, and they have secrets that not even the federal government could get. And, it makes you wonder, I mean, is that okay? Is that something that we should be allowing constitutionally to be going on? Where, for all we know, EG&G could be making stuff for China. We don't know because they are not obligated to have any accountability, even if they're a public. As far as stock exchange and all that stuff, it seems like if the government wants to hide something, or if any corporation wants to hide something, all they have to do is say it's what did you say the other day, Warhamster? Was it intellectual property? Was it? No, it was something where they could just claim this, and it's no one can look into it, and it's kind of kept hush hush.
I'm trying to remember the context.
Well, the context was Area 51, but
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about it, I'll ask the question a different way. There's two things you look at. Do you want the government to be able to look into every private citizen's business? And the answer is probably not. But at the same time, these corporations and foundations, the way they were structured, in the progressive age, were so that the most powerful people in the world can keep themselves safe from liability. That's what a limited liability corporation is. You can sue the company, but you can't sue the owner. Why in the heck would that be allowed? Wouldn't you want to have the owner of a corporation that have to take responsibility for the actions of the company he controls? And these foundations, I mean, all the secrecy, we've created a bunch of tax and legal structures. Somehow it's okay. And I don't think this is anywhere near the intent of the founding fathers. Would you allow entities that basically, give somebody the right to hide from, the responsibility of their own actions and not
Right.
be transparent?
And let me add to that real quick, especially if you're getting public funds. That's another thing. EG&G, a bunch of government contractors that that can keep all those secrets, and they don't have to tell anybody and work with the Department of Energy, is that they're getting our funding. They're getting citizens' money to do these black projects and do all these things under the guise of national security or whatever. Because I understand, if Lockheed is making this special jet for the military, we don't want anyone to know. But also, I feel like if they're using public money, there's got to be some kind of. I feel like there's that border kind of like what Doug and I were talking a while back about like land. You know, there's that line where it's like, okay, we don't want to cross this, but also we don't, want to, we can't have this crossed. So again, it's with the government and with corporations and let's say when they come together.
Well, let's stop there just for a second. Now, let's go back into history just a little bit. One of the problems during the approach to the Revolutionary War was that the British government was promoting something called mercantilism. And what mercantilism basically, and it was kind of a side effect of what they were doing. In other words, it was a product of what they were doing. Because what they were doing is, remember, the colonies were seen as a revenue source. So they basically just served the empire by producing material and, making revenue. And part of the revenue was taxation. To avoid that taxation, what the colonists began to do is they began to buy products from other countries. And so laws were put out by Parliament saying, well, you can't buy materials from other countries. You're only allowed to buy British products. And on top of that, we're only going to allow you to buy from certain British companies. Mercantilism. What that's
a cartel. That is a cartel.
And why were those companies the ones chosen? Because they had a good relationship. They, there was hands in each other's pockets, all of that. That's what that all was. So the very idea of trying to get away from corporations and government colluding together to basically screw the people goes all the way back to before the Revolutionary War, and it was actually one of the primary reasons we fought that war. And here we are now, not only allowing the collusion that we fought against, but we've made it legal with limited liability and all this other stuff. And now we have the government on top of that going, well, we're not only going to do that, but, if they get in trouble and we think that they're important, we'll even bail them out. So we've got mercantilism on steroids when it comes to the big corporations right now and the collusion with the government. And it's an age-old problem that we fought a war over, if that makes sense.
There's one difference between today's crony capitalism and the mercantilism of the days gone by. The mercantilist theory back then is there was a finite supply of gold and silver on the planet. And their idea,
and most of it was in Europe.
And their idea, and they were fighting over who would keep the most in their country. They wanted who had the biggest hoard of dragon's gold. Now they've got this concept because globalism is more important than nationalism. They've done away with the idea of the nation state, and they want this globalist idea, and they believe there's an unlimited supply of money because they can print it out of thin air with ones and zeros. Sorry, Alan. That's for our good friend Alan, who doesn't like the word printing. They can, they can summon it out of thin air, and what they really do care about is power. Mm-hmm. But it's the same idea. It's still crony capitalism. It's still cartel behavior. And again, the most important part of a cartel, it's a few interested groups in similar industries to maximize their own benefit, but much more importantly, to eliminate competition. And the way they do that in America today is they buy politicians. And this is campaign contributions. You buy a politician because you want them to enact laws to create barriers to entry so nobody can compete with you, and to make sure you can never be prosecuted for your own, shenanigans. And that is how the American political machine works. Our cartels pooling their money to buy groups of politicians on both sides of the aisle to create the legislation that they want. The politicians don't write the legislation. This is written by corporate lawyers and lobbyists. And they know exactly what the results are going to be.
I have a question. I have two questions. One's kind of separate. It was something that was stewing for a while, but one that ties in with what I was just talking about. Can we constitutionally, can we make a law that either prohibits or caps the amount that you could give to a politician?
Wait a second. Have you been talking to Warhamster? Oh, this is right. Okay, go ahead, Warhamster. Have fun with it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for asking, Andrew.
the moment you came out of your mouth, I could, I could hear the grin forming on Warhamster's face. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I've been talking for several months or even longer about a proposed amendment. Everyone talks about getting money out of politics. Makes a lot of sense. We don't have a representative form of government right now. Elections are bought and sold. Whoever gets the most campaign contributions generally wins. And that money comes from PACs and super PACs. This is not okay. So I have a constitutional amendment. It's pretty simple. It's only got a few parts to it. And the first is the only people who can contribute to a political campaign are registered voters. Forget this nonsense of corporations are people too. If a corporation was a person, they'd be allowed to vote. Since they cannot vote, ergo, they are not citizens. They are not people. The only people who can contribute are registered voters. Very simple. Second of all, campaign contributions cannot cross state or county lines. We all agree that foreign interference in elections is a bad thing. If your election's countywide, no one from outside the county can contribute. If you live in the county, you can contribute. If you don't, you can't. It's pretty simple. We don't want California big tech billionaires, donating to people all over the country. The third thing is, you asked about the limits. Well, we've got very good campaign contribution limits for individuals right now, and that includes what's the term? Not cash contributions. What's the word, Doug? I'm looking for non-material contributions, in-kind contributions. So if I were to say own a restaurant and I were to give it up to my local politician for free, you can use my venue. Well, there's a monetary cost to that. I can't add more money onto that. The current campaign contribution limits and rules are reasonable, so we don't change them at all. So what you've just done is you've defunded the national political party systems. You've taken away all the power of the DNC and the GOP, nationally and statewide, because they no longer can distribute money to their favorite candidates. It can only be done by individuals. And that way the local individual has got to make a reasonable argument for why you should cast a vote for him, as opposed to, I check an R or a D, or I saw a bunch of advertisements, or this person had more money so they could print more yard signs. That's not the way elections, that's not what a representative government does. A representative government has people listening to their candidates' ideas and saying, hey, this person represents me the best. I'm going to cast my vote. It absolutely forces people to get more involved in their elections again, which is what we want.
Right.
That's my amendment.
Yeah, and if anyone's thinking this, either watching or not watching, a way to not fix it, because I really like that amendment. I think that is fantastic, and so does Stephanie in the chat.
Hey, Steph.
That getting rid of parties would not solve anything, because Doug has mentioned in the past that the founding fathers don't like parties, but they know that naturally we're going to create them anyway. So that's why we need to create other cogs in order to prevent what has kind of happened, because they removed those cogs essentially, especially with the 16th and 17th Amendment. But anyway, Doug, did you have anything on that?
No, we're good.
And on the amendment?
That's the reason why I let him just have at it. It's fantastic idea, and I think it is in line with what founders would consider, because because of those limitations. It's just a matter of putting it out there.
And I'd like to my credit, note that I was able to do the whole thing without, all night I've not said representative democracy. I didn't use the D word the entire time. It's representative government. We are not a democracy.
Maybe those politicians think they're in a different country. Maybe we have we don't, but maybe your country, whatever that is, Crazyland does. But here's another question that's kind of going in with trying to solve the corporate entanglement and also maybe help with foreign interferences. Could we have a isolationist kind of policies where, kind of like China, in the sense of, bear with me here, that we encourage export but restrict import? So, if corporations want to sell to other countries, that's fine. Obviously, we'd need to figure out a way where that doesn't become awry, but, they can't.
You're talking about tariffs.
I guess I ain't too smart about tariffs, so I guess you'll have to maybe
Well,
help.
that's an interesting. It's an interesting question because I haven't heard Doug opine on this one. I am actually a fan of tariffs, and this whole idea of free trade that everyone tells us about. No, that's not okay. That's the way of sending your own jobs offshore.
Free trade is not okay. The idea is that trade should be should figure it out. Should be negotiated in a manner that's going to be to our advantage. Number one. Number two, though, tariffs are just like anything. It's a valuable tool, but you want to use it in moderation. If you don't have tariffs at all, you're going to be walked all over. If you put tariffs too high, you're not going to be able to import products because nobody's going to want to deal with you. So you have to find that happy balance, and I think that's what President Trump was attempting to do.
Well, I'm glad you said that because it makes a lot of sense. If you want to influence other nations' behavior without resorting to clandestine or overt military operations, the best way to do it is through trade. For example, if you have a very irresponsible country like that has a bad human rights record, let's call it Iran for today's purposes.
Right.
You put tariffs on them. You can import your oil, but it's going to have a 30 or 40% tariff. It's going to be non-competitive on our markets, and countries that don't have have reasonable policies that we agree with, we're going to have a lower tariff. You incentivize them to do business with us, and we expect them to do the same to us, and that is totally fair game to have tariffs, and it doesn't create trade wars. It creates an incentive basis for people to have responsible governments.
Right, I agree.
You don't need the cloak and you don't need the cloak and dagger, and you don't need the. There's no reason for war ever again.
The reason why they freak out over tariffs is because, and a lot of people believe this, and when they use this excuse, they knew it wasn't true. Smoot-Hawley, exactly. Smoot-Hawley was blamed for the Great Depression. Smoot-Hawley was tariffs, and while I will admit it didn't help the situation, it didn't cause the Great Depression. The Great Depression was caused by the Federal Reserve. But see, they had to point your eyes away from that. They didn't want you to realize it was their artificial manipulation of the economy and of our monetary system with the Federal Reserve. And so they blamed it on Smoot-Hawley. And everybody go, oh, look, it was Smoot-Hawley, and be mad at tariffs. And so to this day, the people who have fallen for that garbage, the moment... And this came to my mind the moment it was said, when Trump said, well, I'm going to start using tariffs. And everybody is freaking out in the media because they were taught from day one Smoot-Hawley was a cause. It's not like they could reason or think about it. They just believe it because that's what they were told. And Smoot-Hawley was not the cause of the Great Depression, and tariffs can be a very valuable tool if used properly.
And who should be the governing body in the United States that sets the tariffs?
Well, that should be the legislature.
That's a legitimate function of Congress because the federal government's one of their legitimate functions is to handle international affairs.
Right. Well, and the thing is, the idea was the president can have his members of his staff or he himself negotiate, but in the end, even if it wasn't legislatively put out and it was a negotiation, even in that case, who still has to give the final say? United States Senate. It's with the advice and consent of the Senate, which was who? State legislature. The states. Yeah. So I mean, once again, we're getting into how far we are from Kansas.
Let me pile on to that concept because I agree about 99.8% with what you said. Okay. And either you put a comma there that I'm kidding. The people that opposed Trump the most from the Republican side was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mm-hmm. U.S. Chamber of Commerce is supposed to protect all businesses, but they protect the biggest businesses. They're the ones that have been writing these free trade bills like NAFTA and this whatever that Asian trade deal that Trump scuttled on day one. All those trade deals, those were Chamber of Commerce deals. Basically, this goes back to the cartel behavior. They're giving carve-outs for their favorite corporations to get really favorable trade deals in these foreign countries in return for these foreign countries to have their favorite companies be able to trade here. It was basically a big grab bag. That's what these trade deals have been. They call it free trade, but it's just the opposite. What it is cartel trade. It's
And
monopolies.
it goes all the way back to what I was talking about earlier. It's just another version of mercantilism.
Oh, and Tracy just showed up. Hi, Trace.
So are y'all ready for another question?
Bingo, bring it.
All right. So obviously any federal policing agency is considered illegal. Am I correct?
Unconstitutional. If you go to Article 1, Section 8, when it comes to executing the laws of the United States, that's supposed to be the militia. While the executive branch is the arm of the federal government that is to execute the laws, the tool they have to do that is the militia, which is directly under the sheriff and the governor. So it's there is no authority for them to have a law enforcement or policing agency in the executive branch. This idea of the FBI and the IRS and the FDA and so on and so forth, really, I mean, they can do the administrative part of it. Let's put it that way. Those agencies are legitimate when it comes to the administrative portion of it. But when if it's a legitimate authority for the federal government to have, but they're not legitimate in the sense of the execution of it. The actual part of the execution of it is supposed to be a partnership between the executive branch and your militias, which are run by, like I said, the governor. I'm sorry, the sheriff locally at the local level, and then ultimately the governor if necessary.
Now, that being said, can they have an intelligence agency? And if so,
yes.
Okay. Is there anything that we could do to? I don't know. I just feel like the CIA is just really. I feel like we really need to get them under control, especially with what they do that we don't know about regularly. And
Well, yeah, you got to go back to as I was talking about the founding of the intelligence agency. They started out as law firms, and these same oligarchical families, these blue blood, corporations on the East Coast, their representatives were in the intelligence agency. They were there to further corporate interests. That's not their mission. That's not their mission. If their mission is to find out intelligence to help with United States security, that's one thing. So they need to be pretty much reeled back in, and you don't want to lose everything they've already done, all the intelligence stuff like that. But interesting. Dan Bongino the last 2 days had an FBI whistleblower on his show the last 2 days instead of doing his normal podcast. And on today's show, it was really interesting how he talked about, because of the centralization of the FBI, you'd get these people in D.C. who are basically briefers. They've never been out in the field. They just know how to give a good briefing, and their entire job is to climb the corporate ladder or the ladder.
Would get a kick out of that statement right there. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, long story short, it shows.
We have a friend who's a cop who's not a retired cop who's not real fond of the Federal Bureau of Incompetence. So that's the reason why I was making that comment. But anyway, continue.
No, it's the entire nature of centralized bureaucracy. This is what the deep state is.
Well, having an intelligence is not unconstitutional. I mean, Washington had his spies during the Revolutionary War and kept a lot of that intact in the sense of guarding us against, invasion and all that, and having persons that could, look into foreign affairs. That's not the problem. The problem is when you've got a centralization and it's being used domestically.
I think that the name itself is kind of an idea of what their true purpose is. I mean, yeah, they do stuff foreign, but they're the Central Intelligence Agency here.
Yeah, there's a lot of thoughts on that. Finishing up with what Bongino was saying is, you end up with these, field agents who actually know what they're doing, but they're taking orders because somebody in D.C. wants to fill a quota. I need you to investigate 20 white supremacists. Well, I don't have any. Well, did somebody have a Gadsden flag, with the bank robber? Yeah. Well, call it a white supremacist, even though it had nothing to do with it. This is where the problem. These people are trying to check boxes, and it's bureaucracy. This is the problem with big government. It's the problem with big corporations. Decentralization is the key to solving a lot of our problems. And that's what the founding fathers got. That's what the federalist system was all about. You had 13 different states that are all these little experimental labs to see what works and what doesn't. And nobody has to do what another state does. Nobody can tell you what to do in your own state. If you don't like what's going on in your state, you have two choices: work to fix it or move.
Right.
That's it.
Another question I have, you're going to see a theme here, Doug, so forgive me.
Yeah,
But,
no, I have to say something real quick. I'm very proud of Warhamster. Fix the situation or move. That's something I've been saying for years. And whether or not he stole it from me or he came up with it on his own or it's a combination of both, I'm very proud of you, Warhamster. Yeah, you know, you're at this point almost a gerbil. But anyway, go ahead.
Oh, that's a demotion.
Oh, man.
I just had to mess with him. But anyway, go ahead.
Can Congress, or is black budgets constitutional?
Absolutely not. 100% transparency in everything the government does.
Yeah,
100%
exactly.
transparency. There was a movie in what probably early 80s called Too Many Secrets. Or is that what it was called? No, it was called Sneakers. And
I'm not familiar.
Robert Redford was in it.
Okay.
Played a really good role, but it was about a bunch of, this is early days of computer technology, and these guys had a bunch of eggheads, and they had a private struggling intelligence agencies, and they stumbled upon government secrets in cahoots with a big corporation, some contractor, one of Redford's character's previous friends, and it was a company called Seacrest Technology, Seacrest something or other, and if you decoded it, it meant too many secrets. And the whole moral of the story was get it out in the open. When the government should have nothing to keep from the people. They work for us.
Right.
They should not be able to hide a single thing. There is no you just saw what the FBI got caught doing with this guy Danchenko, who's going on trial next month. The FBI interviewed him. They knew that he lied. They knew his information was BS. And to keep him from being able to tell anybody that, they hired him as a quote-unquote confidential human source, so nobody can talk to him because we can't give away our sources and methods. That's a load of garbage. This is what they do. This is what the intel agencies. And the other thing Bongino's whistleblower talking about today is the FBI no longer operates as a law enforcement agency. They operate as an intel agency, and they don't have the tools for it. And the way the analogy he used is, imagine you've got a hammer with a screwdriver welded on top. A hammer could do a job for some things, but it doesn't do it very well when there's a screwdriver attached. And you sure as heck can't use a screwdriver with a hammer attached to it. So that's what the FBI has become. They're a law enforcement agency, is what they're supposed to be, and they're operating as an intel agency. And it's funny how that happened. After 9/11, apparently, they were in a room with George H.W. Bush and Mueller's, representing the FBI, and I forget the name of the CIA chief there, but the CIA chief came in there and had a bunch of facts, and we knew who did this. It was Bin Laden, blah blah blah, and they said to Mueller, what do you know? He goes, we don't know anything. And George Bush says, well, I wish you were more like the CIA chief. From that day forward, Mueller centralized the FBI, compartmentalized it, and created this bureaucracy that's the mess it is today. And they started working as an intel agency instead of law enforcement. So it was it's a phenomenal interview. It's worth watching.
All right, Doug, I got another question for you.
Okay.
I'm trying to keep the topic in with money, corporations, Rothschilds. So if I'm going out there, I'm trying to bring it in. But is it constitutional for citizens to basically store money in other countries to, like
let's stop right there for a second. When you say people, you mean private citizens?
Correct.
All right. Understand something. The Constitution was not written to restrain the citizen. It was written to restrain the government it was creating. Okay? Now, that said, there were concerns about foreign influence. So that goes back to our original 13th Amendment, which we were talking about earlier. So the idea was, while the purpose of the Constitution was to restrain the government, there could be dangers of foreign influence or foreign finagling. That was the reason for that. So while currently, from a constitutional standpoint, there's nothing that says that a citizen cannot work with other countries or have money in other places and all that, if it could be defined as treasonous, giving aid and comfort to our enemies, then you could go after them that way. Otherwise, there really isn't a constitutional anything that says a person can't do that. Once again, I want to get back to purpose of the Constitution was to create federal government and limit that government. There are some caveats in there for things other than federal government. For example, Article 1, Section 10 spends a lot of time talking about what the states are not allowed to do. Original 13th Amendment said that a citizen couldn't do certain things. So there are caveats, but currently there isn't anything. It's really all about that federal government. Warhamster, you want to add anything?
Absolutely, and I'm going to answer from a different angle.
Okay.
We should encourage people to have the ability to move their capital elsewhere. This is called tax and monetary competition.
Mm-hmm.
If your government has a restrictive tax or monetary code, you should encourage capital to go elsewhere where it is not being penalized. This forces the government to change their behavior because they lose their capital base. It's absolutely a positive thing to have a capital go elsewhere. United States is one of only 3 countries in the entire planet right now where you do not have the free right to take your capital offshore. If I were to become an expat to, say, the Cayman Islands, there's an excise tax. I get taxed of almost 50% of the money I take over there if I'm renouncing my U.S. citizenship. We are very restrictive, and that's abusive. This should not be the case. If you're from England and you move to America, you're going to bring all your money with you. There you have it. So this is called tax competition, and it forces the government to be responsible and reasonable in their tax codes. So it's a very important concept. Capital must have the freedom to cross borders. That forces governments to be responsible.
Okay. All right. That's I wasn't quite leading, but I was, just because I feel like that's, if Al Capone could put money somewhere else so that way he could hide it for whatever, but that's also.
So are you saying that the response kind of surprised you?
It did. I was expecting you to maybe not totally disagree with me on that.
Here's why I asked that question. This is why this podcast is so important. So you're asking because I bet you the average person out there went, "Whoa, huh?" You're asking these questions, not even realizing really maybe that the average person out there has that same thought. They might even not realize they fully have exactly that way question, but they've thought about that thing. So that's why, and I'm kind of advertising this a little bit to you listeners to spread the word about this. We are answering questions that the people have out there that they're not getting answers to. And some of them don't even realize it needs to be asked. And so I want to just kind of once again appreciate that was asked and why that was so important, and why those of you who have stumbled upon this, or your followers of Andrew or myself or Warhamster or any combination thereof, that you spread the word about this podcast so that people get a chance to hear these answers, because there's nobody out there talking about it. Nobody. And I bring the constitutional end, and then Warhamster brings more of a color commentator is what I like to say. Is there another way you would like to put that in?
Just a different experience. I come from a different angle at times.
Yeah, I mean, because we both understand this stuff thoroughly. But yeah, exactly. We sometimes look at the same question from a slightly different angle, not because of our knowledge, but because of our experiences. And I think that is huge. But once again, that was a good question, and it definitely bears. It needs to be shared. It needs to be put out there. Oh, stop, Warhamster! You got followers. You just don't know it.
So I'm gonna go ahead with the next. Were you done, Doug? I didn't want to.
Yeah, I'm done. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So we actually have our very first question in the chat in the whole history of the show. Tracy E asked, which I believe you already covered this, but So the government sending trillions to Ukraine in aid, is that constitutional?
Well, that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about private money and private persons. We're not talking now. When it comes to the government, question is, are they authorized? Well, they are authorized to handle foreign affairs, but is there a specific authority in the Constitution giving the federal government the ability to disperse money as needed, or as they think it's needed, should I say? Not necessarily. So so we do have I think, a constitutional crisis there. I don't believe that foreign aid, in the way that we are distributing that aid, is constitutional nor very smart. That said,
I would say
are there times when we would need to assist certain allies? Sure, I get that, and there were times when the early presidents sent money places, or they helped out, and I have no problem with that on a limited scale. But what we've got going on right now is outside what I think were original principles.
yeah, I would say the federal government was given the authority and a limited budget to handle international affairs, and if it's in the best interest
Mhm.
of this union of states to send money someplace, they have the authority to make that decision. But I put the caveat out there that should be done with full transparency, and we don't have that in Ukraine. That's where the issue lies: is nobody's tracking the money, making sure it goes to where it says it's going to go, making sure it's not lining people's pockets. There's no responsibility there whatsoever. That's where the issue lies.
Yeah.
But they have the authority. They certainly have the authority. What they shouldn't do is they shouldn't have the ability to summon money out of thin air. That's where the unconstitutional part. Where'd the money come from? Well,
Right.
they just
Well,
that's where
and the fact that they're funding our enemies, would that not be giving aid and comfort to enemies? So right there, you're in violation of Article 3 when it comes to treasonous activities. So I don't think, from a constitutional standpoint, any money's going to any country that could be considered not friendly. I don't think that would be constitutional in any way, shape, or form.
well,
Now,
if they form a government the way we want it to be formed, we won't have enemies. There won't
No,
be
no,
such a
we will have emulators and those who wish to be more like us. Yeah,
yeah.
now, oh,
which
go
is
ahead.
what was happening early on.
Yeah. Did you
Your
have
show,
anything?
brother. Nope,
Oh,
your show, brother. What's your question?
now it wasn't a question; it was more a comment on that. Now, if you said this, Doug, forgive me. I was reading the chat. If now, I believe you did say you had no problem with it as if it had a direct effect to us. So, for instance, let's say we're against Russia, Ukraine's on our side. There's no,
Well,
you
I
know,
wouldn't necessarily go that far, but go ahead.
I'm creating a hypothetical world right now.
Okay.
Let's say Ukraine is a-okay in our book and they're an ally. Let's just pretend. Um, if by funding them would help directly from basically keeping Russia at arm's distance, then you would be fine with that. Is that correct? Is that what you've said in the past? If it directly affects us as far as
Well,
preventing,
I think what you're getting into is the term foreign entanglements, which really isn't technically a constitutional thing. It was an attitude of the founders, and the George Washington talked about it, Adams talked about it, and on a limited basis, Madison and Monroe did.
The
Um, and
Monroe Doctrine made a lot of sense.
mhm. And basically, the idea was that we should not be involved in foreign anything, war, arguments between countries, or whatever, unless it directly influences us or affects us and our interests. So, for example, while Adams was president and France and Britain are going at it in war, and Jefferson's like, hey, we ought to give some support, to France. And Adams says, no, we should not. Foreign entanglement. We need to stay out of it. Doesn't affect us. And gosh, if you support the wrong one and they lose and things like that, it could come back and get you if you want to have a good relationship with the other ones later. So you just stay out of it, leave it alone. And Jefferson was like, this is about the only time in my life where I've really considered Jefferson to be wrong on something. Jefferson then adds, well, gosh, we should at least put out verbal support or written support. We should, at least say it. And Adams like, no, we shouldn't. Once again, foreign entanglements. We don't want to be involved unless it directly affects us. This is their problem. Let them duke it out. We are to have no support, no opinion. And I actually agree with that. And what Adams during his presidency was not one of my favorites. Jefferson is one of my favorites. So I do take an opposite stance on those two in that. But I think it's very important that we understand. Now, see, that goes back to things like now, should we have been in Iraq? Should we have been in Afghanistan? Should we have been in World War I or World War II? You ask these questions, and in the case of World War I, not at first, but when it affected us directly, perhaps. World War II, we were attacked, war was declared against us. Absolutely, we should be. When you go through all these situations. Should we have Iraq? Well, no, they really didn't directly affect us. And to be honest with you, I don't remember any of the 19 being Iraqi. And besides, there's a whole different conversation about that.
All right.
That
so let me jump in.
Don't want to start. But my point is, getting back to foreign entanglements. Should we be involved in foreign entanglements? From the founding fathers' principles were no, not unless we are directly and absolutely directly influenced, and it absolutely directly influences our interests. All right, go ahead, sir.
Well, had we not been lured into World War I, Europe would not have had, the British would not have had the confidence that we were going to intervene in World War II.
True enough.
But that's when you go back to, okay, this goes back into Rothschild stuff. In 1921, the Council of Foreign Relations was created, which basically has been running our foreign policy for the most part ever since. These are the same people sits on the Council of Foreign Relations. These are the same people that sit on the boards of those same banks, that finance the Nazis, etc. That's the Council of Foreign Relations. This would be Rockefeller over here. They were married at the hip with the Royal Institute of International Affairs over in England. These are two groups that coordinate just about everything that goes on globally. This carving up of the world into different, creating the borders post-World War II. The Council of Foreign Relations on one end, it's basically private entities running our foreign intelligence or directing them. Same thing with the RIAF. RIAI, Royal Institute of International, RIIA, sorry. I have a tough time with that acronym. And that's Rothschilds and the other connected families in England. They've never stopped their meddling. They've never stopped being part of America foreign policy. We are joined at the hip when it comes to that. That's why they call it the Anglo-American Transatlantic Rules-Based Order. That's what the post-World War II has been. Did we have interest in intervening in World War I? No, we didn't. It had nothing to do with us. But they pretended they sank one of our boats, and that gave the people handling Woodrow Wilson the votes they needed. They killed Americans. So same thing. We can talk about how we got into World War II.
Talk about the Lusitania.
Yeah, Lusitania. Yeah, which was carrying armaments. So we're already being involved. The people financing the Nazi war machine didn't want to get into World War II. FDR did. FDR was an internationalist. He was always an internationalist, as opposed to a nationalist. That's the difference between the two parties. Did Pearl Harbor, was it allowed to happen, or did they sneak up on us? Well, there's a lot of evidence.
There's a lot of discussion there too.
Yeah, and that was FDR's excuse to get us into the war. So, obviously Pearl Harbor did happen. A lot of our ships were somehow magically moved out of the way beforehand. We declare war on Japan immediately. And then because Japan's an ally of Germany, Germany declares war on us.
Right.
Then we enter World War II on the side of the British. You're going to have to get a little bit of tinfoil hat on to, start and talk about who actually started World War I and World War II, and why was Winston Churchill an intricate part of both, and what is his connections to the Round Table, and what is the Round Table's connection to the Rothschilds and other families. We can go. That's a whole show all on its own, and there's probably people more educated. Carroll Quigley, who was actually Bill Clinton's mentor, but he's a brilliant scholar from Georgetown University. Carroll Quigley's book, I'll think of it in a second here, Tragedy and Hope. talks about all this stuff and just lays it out. He's one of the best researchers of the 20th century. Goes into all these things about how these connections work clandestinely behind the scenes. Yeah. So why are we involved in this stuff? Because we were forced to by the same oligarchical banking and finance interests that have been playing Game of Thrones for centuries. It's the same story over and over again.
Here's a question for the both of you, and I have a feeling War Hamster is probably gonna jump on this one. I'm kind of teeing it up a little bit, but was World War II an excuse to get us out of the Great Depression? Because after all, the bankers,
it didn't get us out of the Great Depression.
It did not?
No.
Nope.
I could have sworn that one of the
That's
things.
what they want you to believe.
Okay.
Warhamster,
All right,
you want to start? You want to start on this one,
Let's go.
or is this a topic we want to start? Because I mean, we're at 7:00.
I can't do this one concisely. It takes a whole lot of background information. A lot of it's the stuff we're talking about, all the causes leading up to the war.
Yeah, because we're already an hour and a half in, and I've got a wife who we saw earlier, stuck her head in. She's off work. She wants me to take her out to dinner. So,
World War II was, why did the Nazi regime go to war? Ask yourself that. Why were they allowed to build up their military-industrial forces financed by American banking interests? Why did the British? Look, I'll make the argument right now that World War I was basically caused by some of the bad actors in Britain, these round table types that realized Germany's industrial base was surpassing their own. They hate competition. So they basically got Germany involved in a war because they were allies with Austria. So it was an Austrian war. It should have been a local battle. But Austria gets in a war, Germany has to go. Next thing you know, Germany, for a war they didn't start and a war they didn't lose, has to pay the price for everybody else. Britain came out of it looking really good for about 20 years. But Britain had their own problems, or the UK had their own problems with labor union and central bank issues and stuff like that. And they didn't grow as strongly after World War I as they wanted to, while the United States kept getting stronger and stronger because, once again, we were barely touched in the war. So the nice thing about living in the United States is we're so isolated. We're impossible to invade. We don't get hurt by world wars. Europe does. So was So why did the Germans decide to invade Poland and start World War II? Well, let's look at the Treaty of Versailles. There were German territories that were just like in the Ukraine today. Ethnic Russians that speak Russian are getting discriminated against by Ukraine because somebody drew a line and put them behind the wrong border. And when we do the Maidan Revolution in 2014, the Ukrainians, who are not exactly the world's nicest people, have basically been terrorizing these ethnic Russians for the last 8 years. And at some point, Vladimir Putin stepped in to save basically their cousins. There's a very good argument to be made that that's one of the main reasons for the Ukraine war that's going on today. Same thing happened.
Well, let's get back to Andrew's original question, though. Is did the World War II, did that get us out of the Great Depression? And the Great Depression was elongated, first of all, by the New Deal. While it was great that there was manufacturing going on and that there was things going on when it comes to our economy and all of that jazz because of the war, because we had to build the war machine, that could have been done simply by government getting out of our hair. And that's kind of what happened once Roosevelt was gone. The restrictions and regulations that government had imposed under Roosevelt began to lessen in the 50s. And that encouraged entrepreneurship. And they wanted to, because as these soldiers are coming back, they wanted them to, be able to do whatever they want them to be able to do. So it encouraged entrepreneurialism, and by reducing the regulations by government. And I'm a firm believer, really, that's what got us out of the Great Depression more so than the war, was the fact that once Roosevelt was gone, once the war was over, the government had reduced regulations, and that reduction of regulations, I think, was the primary cause of getting us out of the tough situation. It encouraged people to go for it, so to speak.
Well, a lot of what you say is correct, and I'm in agreement with. But there is the truth that state capitalism. There's an economic argument to be made that it does work for a limited time period.
Temporarily, yeah.
So yeah, for a limited time period. So
Yeah, it's
when
like
you
Billy
mobilize,
Martin running the Yankees. It'll be successful for a short time, but
you're going to blow out.
but it's
You're going
not
to blow out.
but it's not long term.
Yeah. So what happens is you mobilize the entire nation to be making goods and services. Your GDP is going to go up.
Sure.
People are going to be cutting back. They're going to be eating canned foods instead of steak and stuff like that. Everyone gets united behind America at war. They were very patriotic back then. The whole country was united behind the cause. You're going to increase production, which is how we measure GDP. When you're making a bunch of bombs and bullets and guns and machines, you're going to create GDP. It was the conversion afterwards to peacetime activities, which was, 1950s was a golden age of pure capitalism, pure free markets. That was actually a really strong economy because all of a sudden the government stepped way the heck back and got out of the way. That's the actual history. But yeah, when you're going to mobilize an economy, yeah, you're going to see increased production. But people weren't living well during the war years, even though the economy measured by GDP was going up.
Yeah, but
real income crashed.
Yeah, but England was buying stuff from us left and right. I mean, as far as planes, tanks, I mean, like there's all kinds of things that they were buying, that was getting things moving. I mean, to me, it makes sense. And to me, now I understand that that's not the case, but I'm just saying that would make sense to maybe start a war to create some economic movement and maybe get out of something. But then again, also, I'm not super smart.
No, that school of thought it's not unique to you because there's countries that have actually done it, and there's strategists that are in positions of influence that actually think that way. But think about the consequences for England. They've been the world's de facto reserve currency for several centuries, and post World War II, the stuff they had to buy from us cost them so much economically that we became the reserve currency post World War II. They had to give up their seat at the head of the table monetarily after Bretton Woods in 1947, and England spent 3 decades in basically a depression before they finally started to climb out of it in the 80s. This was not a healthy thing. War is not good for your economy long term, especially if your country actually gets bombed.
Right.
Yeah. Now, someone brought up something in the comments that I'd like to kind of get to, but I want to ask this question real quick because I want to be sensitive. Oh, I can't believe I'm saying that word. I feel very emasculated by saying that. But I want to be sensitive towards Doug's time. Here's a question: do we want to end the show now or have Doug go so that way they can carry on with what needs to be done? Because also I don't want to be rude to your wife because obviously she needs something of you. Do we want to end the show now, or me and Warhamster could kind of continue on a little bit to kind of close it out? I mean, I'll put that up to both of you.
Yeah, that's up to Warhamster. I don't care either way, but I do have a wife that I've heard her open the door like twice.
I am always going to take Virginia's side. So Doug, get the heck out of here. I'll spend another 10 minutes on you with Andrew and see if I can help you out. And Doug, I'll try very hard not to embarrass you in the meantime.
You know that this is basically, by leaving me and Warhamster here, that's like the dad going into the other room to do something, and we're being quiet and like getting into stuff.
Yeah.
So hopefully we do.
Yeah, I understand. More than likely, nothing good can come out of it, except for that you guys have a real good time with the, as Alan would put it, the credit card and the keys to the Ferrari and the keys to the liquor cabinet. But no, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Doug, say your goodbyes. I'll be right back on screen in 1 minute, and
Okay.
I'll jump back in.
All right. What he means by say my goodbyes is I love to end my shows the same way, and I think you guys all deserve it. United we stand, combined we kick butt. God bless America, my friends. God bless you. If you want to learn more about me, DouglasVGibbs.com, PoliticalPistachio.com. Oh, by the way, I have to say this. So I'm working on a new website platform. I want it to be more interactive, more informative, and, well, modern. I've got a great website for like 2001. And so I've been working with some people on this, and today we got the word that the official launch date of the new website platform will be November 1st. And then we will be implementing other services on it, such as video classes and things like that, hopefully by the first of the year. So I'm excited that DouglasVGibbs.com is going to expand and become something wonderful. I was just sharing, I don't know if you could hear me, Warhamster.
I could.
Okay. And I'm pretty excited about it. Now, that said, we got other projects. Whether or not Warhamster wants to talk about them openly yet until it's off the ground, I don't know. But to just expand what I'm doing right now as Mr. Constitution into other, including other entities, and expanding what I'm doing with what I have. Step one in that direction of expanding, getting more eyeballs on what we do and all that, and spreading constitutional literacy throughout this country. The hard date for the new platform is November 1st. So I'm pretty excited about that. All right, Mr. Warhamster, Mr. Andrew, thanks for having me. Well, you guys have fun for these. Tracy says hide the scotch. I don't know. I think it's more tequila when it comes to Warhamster. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the new digs also, Tracy. Thank you. And so we'll see you guys next week here. And I've got my classes and all that. And Warhamster, have a great weekend as well as you, Andrew. And I'm out of here. I've got a wife demanding that I spend some time with her.
Please tell Virginia I insisted you get off the air and go take care of her.
Yeah, I will give you all the credit. I'm a jerk. You did well. All right. Go ahead.
No, I was saying, what about me? I gave part of that credit. I'm the one that's kicking, well, not kicking you out, but I was giving.
He opened the door for you. Yeah, give him credit.
Okay,
he gets credit.
We'll let him have the door. Yeah, but I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. He's like the little brother in the room. Says, "Well, I did something too."
100%.
All right, Pipsqueak, you did something too. All right, now, all right, little brother and compadre, little big show, Constitutional Roundtable. It's been a pleasure as always. I'll see you guys later.
All right.
Good night, Doug.
All right, now that he's gone, no, I'm just kidding.
All right, let's have some fun, brother.
So,
all right, what do you got? What do you got for us?
All right, first, I just want to say this show would be, and I think you and I could both agree with this. Doug is the pillar of the show, so we have a lot of shoe to fill. If that makes sense. So we'll see that if we can make as much of a dent as Doug can in any given time. But and then you are fantastic as well. I'm just here, so I'm making.
No, you're asking great questions, and that's the whole idea of the show. So keep on asking, and I'll do my best to see if I can give you interesting answers.
So Lee, I don't know if he's still in here or not, but he brought up something that would kind of made my ears perk up. It was put in a form of question, but I don't know if it's maybe a comment or if it is actually a question. But he said, remember when the EU, NATO, and U.S. said we would defend Ukraine from Russian aggression so they could give their in-country nukes back to Russia? ?
That's such an interesting question. I'm going to have to go into the history of Ukraine and that sort of thing to answer that correctly.
Feel free.
1991, Russia's Soviet Union is broken up. They always say you can't end communism without, communism can't be ended without, using weapons. No, the Soviet Union just basically decided to break up one day. It was economic pressure. Had less to do with our military spending and more to do with the fact is that centralized control of economies don't work. But they wanted to split it up. And the way it was split up was the way the globalists who were controlling Gorbachev at the time wanted it to be. But the U.S. Secretary of State, James Baker, made a promise on the world stage to the former Soviet Union, Russia, about NATO. He said NATO will not encroach 1 inch closer to Soviet borders. Now, since that time, and I can pull up the graph if I need to. I've got it hidden somewhere on my computer, but we've added 14 countries to NATO, each one incrementally closer to Russia's borders. Well, Ukraine was the red line in the sand. And if we're going to invite them to join the EU and to join NATO, they basically have the ability to launch a nuke that can hit Moscow in about 5 minutes with no warning. That's not okay. That's the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviets tried to park missiles in Cuba, that was not okay with us. And even a guy who really wanted peace like Kennedy had to stand tough for that one. So Russia had no choice when we kept trying to. Go ahead. What's your question?
Well, do you think Putin has? I guess. Do you think because I've not kept up with this, but do you think that if the Ukraine gets a part of NATO and the EU, would Russia retaliate with nukes?
I don't know. Russia's always been very open that nuclear weapons, limited use or expanded use, is always part of their military doctrine. I don't know if that's a bluff or not. Let's hope we never find out. They're never pushed to that point. I think it's more important to realize Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. Period.
Right.
That is just absolutely not acceptable to Russia. They're a sovereign nation that has to protect their own borders. In 2014, oops, you there?
Yep,
You're coming,
I'm right here.
in and out. All right, there you go. In 2014, the Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine, and he was elected. Ukraine itself was somewhere close to 50-50 Ukrainian versus Russian ethnicity. So it was really carved out poorly. It should have been the Ukrainians who would have been one country. And if you weren't going to have the Russian citizens, these separatist regions that are now voting for a referendum to join Russia, they should have been part of Russia the whole time. That was a mistake that was done in the 90s. Like I said, we do a very bad job of carving up territories. Same thing that caused Yugoslavia, the Serbian-Bosnia war. Why would these people be in the same country? They're basically split geographically, and you throw them into a country together where you have an ethnic minority that's going to be exploded by the ethnic majority. That's not a good situation. We did this all post-World War II. That's us and the British and our wonderful globalist strategists that run all these, the Council of Foreign Relations, all this stuff, all these different organizations. I would suggest they do this intentionally. In 2014, the Ukraine had been in negotiations to join the EU and to make some trade deals, but the last minute, Yanukovych says, no, we think we're better off partnering more with Russia. That infuriates the United States and our State Department, Victoria Nuland. We have her on tape with a 2-minute conversations with our Ukrainian ambassador. Victoria Nuland was number 2 at the State Department at the time, or very high up. Jeffy Pyatt was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. We've got a 2-minute video, audio recording of them basically discussing it. Well, 2 weeks before the Maidan Revolution that ousted Yanukovych. Sorry, these last names are tough. Saying, who are we going to put into power? This guy could be in, this guy can't be, et cetera, et cetera. And they're talking about these Ukrainian oligarchs. And these people are basically mafia, these oligarchs. They run corporations, but they run them really poorly. So we basically committed a coup in Ukraine in 2014. That's the Maidan Revolution. Immediately thereafter, Crimea declares their independence, and Russia moves their troops in there, and that's how Crimea became part of Russia. The Crimeans voted with a referendum, something like 90+% wanted to join Russia and not be part of Ukraine. These Donbass region, these 4 separatist areas that they're fighting over right now, these are mostly ethnic Russian people, voted to separate from Ukraine. Russia would not at the time accept them into the Russian Federation. That's what changed this week. That's what Putin's big announcement was. Long story short, Ukraine, with our neo-Nazi battalions, have been staging warfare against these Russian provinces for the last 8 years, bombing them, making it illegal to speak the Russian language in the country of Ukraine. Zelensky's banned opposition parties. They've shut down newspapers that speak out against him. This is not this is Zelensky, who runs around as an American hero, is basically he's a dictator. But he was installed by a guy by the name of Kolomoisky, and here's where it gets fun. Ihor Kolomoisky is a very powerful Ukrainian oligarch, and you want to call him a mobster, feel free. He had a huge financial interest in the company Burisma that hired Hunter Biden. But he also, where it gets really interesting, is he owned a company called Privatbank. So the way U.S. foreign aid works, here's how the money laundering works. So I think Tracy's going to enjoy this part. Basically, we put money, USAID sends money. We're going to give money to Ukraine. So basically, we send a bunch of U.S. dollars and we deposit it in Privatbank, which is owned by Ihor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky's then, the Privatbank is then supposed to lend it out to Ukrainian interests so to help grow their economy, but that's not what he did. He lent it out to a bunch of Kolomoisky-owned enterprises. The money gets laundered through the island of Cyprus, which is very dirty banking in some ways, and somehow Kolomoisky, who can't even set foot in the United States, owns about 50% of the skyline in Cleveland, Ohio, and about 40% of the skyline in Louisville, Kentucky. This is money laundering 101. Yeah, this is all documented too. It all came out in the. And by the way, okay, so Kolomoisky also owns like 9 television stations in Ukraine. I think they only have like 10 or 11. So he's got a lot of influence on public opinion. Well, the U.S. occasionally has to pretend to be a responsible government, and we're trying to cut down on their corruption. And for whatever reason, Privatbank gets nationalized by Zelensky's predecessor, whose name was, I'll think of it here. Doesn't matter. His predecessor ended up nationalized the Privatbank. Well, Kolomoisky's not happy about this, so he runs his own guy, Zelensky, to basically get his own guy in office so he can basically get his bank back. Well, that's Zelensky. Zelensky was an actor who worked for one of the Kolomoisky stations. He's an actor playing the role of president of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's how he got his start. And that's how we got here today. This is the CIA, State Department, working with neo-Nazis and oligarchs in Ukraine. It's been the most corrupt country in the Northern Hemisphere for 20 years. And we're supposed to pretend they're the good guys. Yeah, I'm not saying Russia's good guys or anything like that, but at least Putin's acting, for humanitarian reasons to save some people who've been terrorized by their own countrymen because they happen to speak a different language and have a different ethnicity.
Yeah, I saw somewhere where people were saying that the Ukrainians were actually firing upon their own people, and Russia was actually providing medical aid to those Ukrainians.
Yeah, I believe that's the case. Although the Western media would never ever let you see that.
No.
I believe your version is correct. I say I believe because we're not there. It's hard to tell for sure.
Sure.
But there's one independent watchdog that's there, and I don't recall the name offhand, but they had an interesting report that came out that was on February 16th of this year. They've been tracking the number of explosions going on in the separatist regions for 8 years. And these explosions are basically artillery, basically the Azov battalion and such terrorizing or attacking the separatist regions. Now, this civil war has been going on for 8 years. We just haven't talked about it. Well, in February 16th, the number of explosions in that region per day went from like 40 a day up to like 150, then 250, then up to 800 and thousands a day, leading up to February 24th when Russia actually invaded. So, and at the same time, the Ukrainian military had been mobilizing and moved about 100,000 troops closer to the separatist regions. So it appears that an argument can be made that Putin was cutting off an attack for humanitarian purposes, what have you. And I'll give you 2 other interesting factoids on that note. In 2021, Zelensky made a speech that he was going to liberate Crimea from the Russians. And they actually had about 100,000 troops moving in that direction. Now, Zelensky never makes that speech without U.S. State Department approval. So that's very interesting. And then you've got the stories of the bio labs in Ukraine, and the really interesting one to me was at Davos, Switzerland, the big muckety muck World Economic Forum conference just happened earlier this year. The head of the International Atomic Energy Association let it slip that the nuclear plant, the very first thing Russia seized in that war was that nuclear plant. That plant, he said, yeah, that plant had enough fissile nuclear material to form several nuclear bombs.
Wait a minute. Nuclear power plants aren't supposed to have
Bingo. Yeah. So apparently they had enough nuclear waste there. Yeah. So, and this comes from the head of the International Atomic Energy Association. These aren't my words. These are his.
This is
you can look it up.
The other day.
Yeah. Well,
just different a little bit because we're not talking one. We're talking about this, but there's still,
So, yeah, and I'll drop one last thing about this that I think is very important to understand Russia's foreign policy goals. They've been very well stated for about 20 plus years. And you can look this up online. It's called the Primakov Doctrine. And Primakov was a Russian politician or thought leader, what have you. Some of his students were Putin, Sergei Glaznev, who is the economic mind behind their new central banking system that's apparently working really well. And of course, Sergei Lavrov, who's their brilliant foreign minister. They're all Primakov students. Primakov set out a doctrine for how Russia can survive in the 21st century. And their number one goal, their first pillar, they called it, was to get off what they called the monopolar monetary system, which is basically this transatlantic dollar system that's been dominating the world through the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the Bank of International Settlements. U.S. and England have been bullying the rest of the world monetarily for the last 70 years, and Russia said, we need to get off that. Well, guess what? Mission accomplished. Our sanctions that we put on them, Russia is now trading their oil and grain in gold-backed rubles, and people are accepting it. There's no longer a single currency. And this is good, though, in the long term for the health of the world. It's bad for America right now that we're no longer the global reserve currency, the sole reserve currency.
Mm-hmm.
But it's good for a couple of reasons. Competition is good. It'll force the dollar system to be more responsible, which we talked about earlier with the earlier question. But also, it appears that you can't have a one world government and a one world currency if there's a competing set of governments and currencies.
Yeah.
And we don't want the Great Reset. So there you go.
Here's another interesting thing about if the U.S., which I'm going to touch on this lightly because I have a question back to the nuclear weapons real quick. But from my understanding, because I think I heard Alex Jones talk about this maybe at one point, or maybe it was I don't remember who said this. But anyway, if the U.S. loses its power as the reserve currency, then all the other countries have to do is call in their loans, and we're done.
Okay, good luck collecting. Yeah, good luck collecting. All debts are paid. They're either paid by the lender or the borrower. If the borrower doesn't pay, then the lender pays it. That means they made a bad loan. Yeah, all debts are always paid.
Well, if they call in their loans, couldn't they?
How?
No, just nothing.
Their loan means they bought a U.S. Treasury bond that is due in 30 years. They can't call it prematurely. They can try to sell it. In a seller's market, they're going to get pennies on the dollar or less than they should. They can't call it in. It's a contract.
Interesting.
When you buy a government bond, you can't just call in a loan. Hey, because when we borrow money from China, that's basically them buying our Treasury bonds.
Interesting.
That's the loan. Yeah, it's a form of loan. It's not like a bank loan.
All right, now back to the nuclear weapons. So for people that don't know, and the reason why Warhamster and I were like on the same page with the nuclear weapons was because you're gonna have to correct me if I'm wrong because it's been a minute since I've looked into the research. But so when nuclear weapons were created during World War II, what we did was we took and we did the same process between uranium and plutonium. Which, quick question, is normal power plants, are they run off uranium or plutonium or something else?
Okay, so this is going to be beyond my area of expertise, but I'm going to answer this. I think in World War II we created an atom bomb, and after World War II we created the first nuclear bombs. And that's
Right.
there's a we'll have to bring someone here who knows physics better than I do to explain the
Well,
difference.
one is fission, one is fusion. So the thermonuclear bombs were created through fusion, where they basically take two atoms and collide them into each other, which makes that. The atom bombs or the fission bombs were the ones where basically you take, for instance, the one with uranium. It basically had a gun mechanism where they had uranium here and then they had uranium here and they punched it into it, and that created a detonation. Because the whole point, the reason why, again, for the people watching, the reason why you can't use uranium-235, which is the weaponized, in a power plant is because it's unstable. Well, a lot of people don't realize that you have stable isotopes and unstable isotopes. So anything radioactive at one point can become stable over time, supposedly. I don't believe that the Earth has been around long enough for us to be able to get this, and we definitely most likely have not. But anyway, from my understanding, a power plant has to operate off of a relatively, and this is my opinion from my understanding, relatively stable isotopes or radioactive material in order to function and not become one huge bomb. So that's why whenever he said that Russia took it over and the International Atomic Commission commented on that, the Atomic Energy Commission at the beginning was to monitor nuclear weapons. That was their point. No power plants. It was all about the nuclear bomb. That was the whole point of the Atomic Energy Commission, not to regulate power plants. So when they commented and had that to say about, and with Russia taking over that power plant, I knew instantly there had to have been weaponized plutonium or weaponized uranium or other thermonuclear. Because if I remember, thermonuclear bombs still use plutonium, but they have other stuff in it. I forgot what it was. But anyway, for them to take that over, for it to be an actual asset, it would have to be weaponized nuclear material.
And you know more about this topic than I do, but I recall thinking that the dirty bomb was the biggest concern.
Well, dirty bomb is essentially a nuclear bomb that does not.
It's more limited in scope, but it's yeah. I forget.
What it does, instead of a huge explosion and creating devastation, it essentially has enough explosion for material to leak out and spread. So, but which kind of counteracts from thought that uranium could actually be touched and not be toxic, not be not affect our bodies. So the dirty bomb, to me, from the things I hear, doesn't make sense. But then again, also, if it's in the air, I think if we breathe it in, it could hurt us. So that's the point of the dirty bomb, is a nuclear bomb that spreads the radioactive material to where we inhale it, and it gets in our bloodstream. So
yeah, I think that, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I didn't watch it, but I've heard a lot of people talk about that movie Chernobyl, and apparently there's all the thousands of people who live near there end up with mutations and stuff like that. So there is something to, obviously, that radiation has a harmful effect. I don't think that's a question.
But I think the point was, which actually I saw a video from the 50s where the guy put in his mouth and he was perfectly fine. So I don't remember what makes it bad, but I know that to the touch, and I think even Bob Lazar mentions this because he is into nuclear science. He actually has a website called United Nuclear. That's his company. That you can touch it, and it's not going to hurt you, but you have to have it enter your bloodstream somehow for it to hurt you.
We should bring my cousin, the nuclear scientist, on this call. I got a cousin who's into that stuff, or that's what he does for a living.
Oh, okay.
Pretty smart guy. I don't talk to him much, but
Yeah, that would be a good idea. That man who put it in his mouth.
oh, I'm sure his security clearances would prevent him from saying anything useful besides from maybe from an educational standpoint. No, it's really interesting because you talk about how the International Atomic Energy and all its different affiliates over the years were created, and it ties into, it's that same time period. We're creating these intelligence agencies, and we're creating, this need to know classification security stuff. The stuff that's so high the president doesn't even get to know about it, and we're talking about a shadow government, and it's completely unconstitutional. Which is the whole point of this. This broadcast is the Constitutional Roundtable. Where do these guys get the authority to do everything they're doing? And if it was transparent, would the people stand for it? And the answer is no. So transparency is the key to stopping this nonsense.
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
So I don't have anything else. Do you have anything else?
Nah, I just came to hang out with you, my friend. Answer
Okay.
any questions I could and ask a few questions of my own.
All right. So I think we're going to call it. It is 10:31 my time, 7:31 your time, I believe. That was the quickest math I've ever done in my life. I'm very proud of that. I'm going to call it a night. Warhamster, you hang out for a second after I end it. But anyway, for everyone watching, thank you for watching. Everyone watching later, feel free to join us and you can ask questions and you can get them answered by Doug and Warhamster. So anyway, everyone have a good night and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.